Ready? Okay. Okay, so welcome to this lecture this morning. My name's Gretchen. I promise I won't yell at you today. That's why I have a microphone. I did want to do this presentation here at this event, not just because it's sponsored by the US Embassy, but also because I think we need to be talking about imperialism in classrooms, especially because our work doing media literacy has achieved so much. We've been able to have students think critically about media. They can see racism in media. They can identify patriarchy in media. But what about imperialism? What about colonialism? And so that's the goal of today's presentation, is to introduce the ways in which we can think about media imperialism, and particularly the constraints that it has on speech and news across many different types of platforms. And I'm gonna start now because there's no point to wait. So the outline for the talk is just to kind of catch us all up with what has been termed the civilized hypocrisy. This is the coverage that we've seen in Ukraine, and in comparison to Palestine, it's evident that there is a civilized hypocrisy. So I have a short clip about this. I want to historicize media imperialism. Like I said, I think this is really important to understand the root causes of this civilized hypocrisy in the media. And of course, this means talking critically about media bias in Western news coverage, thinking about Ukraine and Palestine, censorship on social media, and then also ways in which we can resist media imperialism. So just in case you were busy with school and lives and weren't watching the coverage of the war in Ukraine, I wanted to play this clip from American Palestinian comedian, and he introduces himself if you're not familiar with his work.
Hey everyone, it's Amr Zahir, and for white people that's Amr Zar, and for the American media that's uncivilized. We have all witnessed the Russian invasion of Ukraine unfolding in front of our eyes. The American and European media have detailed the Ukrainian people's suffering. Ukrainians are brave, steadfast, and heroic for resisting invasion and occupation by any means necessary, including with Molotov cocktails. Their grandmothers are depicted as courageous wartime field generals.
This is where they make the Molotov cocktails?
Let those Russian shits come here, she says.
Good for you, Granny.
How did you learn how to make Molotov cocktails? You Googled it.
Of course, she says.
Wait, white people are not to Google how to make a Molotov cocktail? That's awesome. Oh, and unlike us Arabs, these Ukrainians are blonde-haired, blue-eyed, and civilized.
But this isn't a place, with all due respect, like Iraq or Afghanistan. This is a relatively civilized...
Now the hypocrisy, duplicity, deceit, and whiteness of it all is just too much to respond to with any level of politeness. But I'm going to try to address it all with civility, courtesy, and respect. No, I'm not. You think we're uncivilized? Since the beginning of the 20th century until today, when we've had modern warfare tactics, the white world has killed exponentially more people than the uncivilized brown world. 20 million in World War I, 60 million in World War II. Pretty civilized. Was it civilized to drop an atomic bomb on Japanese civilians in Hiroshima, killing 80,000 people instantly, 30% of that city's population, ravaging future generations, and then knowing all that mass destruction and murder, doing the same thing in Nagasaki 3 days later? Are we really going to be lectured about civility by a society that, upon invading this land of America, promptly massacred the natives, stole their land, expelled the rest of them, and then has the audacity to name its new states after the people they stole it from? Who did we steal this one from? They call themselves Dakota. Okay, cool, but there's a lot of land here. Yeah, you're right. We'll do a north and a south. Very civilized. I'm definitely not going to be lectured about civility by society that, upon arriving on the shores of America in the early 1600s, immediately started enslaving black people, did that for 150 years, then wrote a declaration and a Bill of Rights that said all men are created equal, then kept enslaving black people for another 100 years. years, then killed 600,000 of each other over whether or not slavery was a good idea, then raised statues of the people who thought it was a good idea, then implemented segregationist Jim Crow laws for another 100 years, and today still kills unarmed black people in the streets and crowdfunds to defend the murderers. I mean, give me a break. I'm gonna listen about civility from people who made up a war to invade Iraq. I mean, they lied about it, and we know they lied about it. 5,000 American soldiers needlessly died. 1 million Iraqis died. They burned and bombed libraries. They destroyed a civilization, and they did this.
Who in the Lord's name does Putin think gives him the right?
Maybe he thinks he's you.
President Bush has stated his determination to remove Saddam from power. In the view of many in Congress, they share that view, and I am among them. And I would vote that way again today. It was a right vote then, and it would be a correct vote today.
Is it civilized to continue to support and supply the bombing of Yemen's children and civilians, which has killed close to 400,000 people, despite a broken promise to end that inhumane policy? Let me tell you a few things about us uncivilized Arabs. Modern surgery and anesthesia were introduced to the world 1,000 years ago by an Arab doctor. His name was Az-Zahrawi. Many engineering mechanisms, including the crankshaft, were invented over 800 years ago by an Arab inventor and engineer. His name was Al-Jazari. The first university in the world was established in Morocco over 1,200 years ago by an Arab philanthropist. Her name was Fatima al-Fihriya. Algebra came from us too. I mean, I know most Americans don't know how to do algebra. It was introduced to the world 1,200 years ago by a Muslim mathematician in Baghdad, a man named Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi. In fact, there's still an Iraqi family named Al-Jabri, like algebra, like they invented the shit. Meanwhile, in civilized America, we have a game show called Are You Smarter Than a Fifth Grader that nobody can win. There have been 250 contestants on Are You Smarter Than a Fifth Grader, okay? 2 winners, just 2. One's a school superintendent, so she already knows the questions that are on the show. The other is a Nobel Prize winner in physics. These are apparently the only 2 American adults that are smarter than a 5th grader. In America, if you're smarter than a 5th grader, you win $1 million. In Iraq, if you're smarter than a 5th grader, you're 11 years old and you go to the 6th grade. That's it, there's no prize. And you know what? 800 years ago, the city of Baghdad had municipal sewage for its 1 million residents. At the same time, European kings and queens were still shitting in a hole in the ground. Who's civilized now? And Arabs also gave you this, and this, and this, and this, and we're sorry about this, but we also gave you this. And then we have the most civilized of them all, Israel, supported by almost the entire civilized white world. Israel massacres whole family and carpet bombs high-rise buildings in Gaza, a city made up of refugees, people who literally cannot escape. They even watch the bombings and cheer from their hilltops. Quite civilized. And what does Israel think of refugees? Well, if they're Jewish, we welcome them with open arms and make them citizens immediately. But if they are Yemeni Jewish, we have to steal their babies. And if they're African Jewish, we have to throw away their donated blood. And finally, and this is very important, if they're Palestinian refugees, they're a demographic threat, and they can never return to destroy our civilized democracy. Palestine has actually been ground zero for the civilized hypocrisy for centuries. You know that guy you civilized people pray to every Sunday? He's Palestinian. We prayed to him before you did. We still do. And he's our cousin, our uncivilized cousin. He doesn't belong to you. You can borrow him every now and then because we're generous, but you can't have him. You even tried to make one of our Palestinian heroes one of yours, civilized idiots. And where was the outrage when she was sent to jail for 7 months? Get your own teenage hero standing up to occupation soldiers. Don't steal ours. So what I'm trying to say is this. War is ugly no matter the perpetrator or the victim. Refugees deserve sympathy, help, and justice no matter their ethnicity, race, religion, tribe, or whatever. Hopefully the civilized world will figure that out one day. So I look forward to an epic news story about an Arab grandmother supplying her neighborhood with homemade weapons to defend her homeland. Until then, I wish justice for every Ukrainian refugee of today and every other refugee of yesterday.
So I promise not to talk that fast. But what I'm arguing with this presentation and why I'm starting with this video is because to understand civilized hypocrisy, to understand why we don't have the same coverage afforded to Ukrainians coming from Palestine is because of media imperialism. So before we dive into media imperialism, Wissam has a mic, and I'd like to hear from somebody in the audience. Can you define what is imperialism? Why are we talking about imperialism before we define it? We need to define it. So what is imperialism? Don't Google it. Give me your thoughts. You have 3 seconds, because that's how long it takes to do a Google search. You have to raise your hand if you want to speak so Wissam can see you. Wissam is over here. Imperialism? Don't want to talk on the mic? Shout it out. Nobody's going to grade you on your answer. There's no award at the end for the most correct answers. What is ideas that support the empire? Yeah, imperialism. Another suggestion? Yes? No? Okay. Thank you for that.
I would say to incorporate any other substance, either if it's a land, a people, an idea, to exploit it,
Yeah.
and to conquer it.
Okay.
And to, yeah, basically that's it.
So this is good. I think between both of these definitions that have been offered, we're getting very close to what Samir Hameen has talked about. If you're not familiar with his work, I would recommend that you read it if you're interested in these issues. He also helps us distinguish critically imperialism, because sometimes this word gets thrown around, the rise of Russian imperialism, Chinese imperialism. But when you look at gross national product, when you look at economic profit, when you look at the military machines, it is the US at the top. And it's going to be a long way before these other nations that are impoverished in comparison can be afforded such labels. So Samir Amin talks about imperialism from the perspective of taking territory, maintaining control and influence. This can be seen through political, economic, and as was also mentioned in some of the definitions from the floor, cultural. And we know that Edward Said also wrote a book called Cultural Imperialism just on this issue. So I recommend you have a look at this work. There's also been a long history of scholarship since the 1960s in communications on imperialism, on media imperialism specifically. In 1969, Schiller was one of the first theorists to think about media imperialism in a systematic way. He talked about the US communication system as being part of media imperialism. And then, of course, scholars since have really documented the multitude of ways in which media facilitates imperialism. So you can check out these resources. So today, I want to give you a bit of context on what is media imperialism, and to do that, I think we need to go a little bit back to history. And so I'm going to see if this works. Testing, testing. The other one, thank you. So we're going to start in the 19th century, talking about how technology facilitated media imperialism. Then we'll come to the 20th century and look at the rise of the military-industrial communications complex. This is another term coined by Schiller and media imperialist scholars. So we'll talk about what that is. And then because of this scholarship, because of this activism around media imperialism, we have the rise of resistance movements trying to conquer this through actions at UNESCO, bringing together non-aligned movement actors and formulating a new world information communication order and the rise of the right to communicate. So that happened in the 1960s to 1980s. It's also one of the reasons the US left UNESCO, if you remember, in the 1980s. And then we're going to talk about the first social net war that took place originating from Chiapas in Mexico, so we'll talk about that in 1994. And then we can see, obviously, through today, and perhaps even through some of your own experiences, being censored on these very diverse media platforms that we have access to, media platforms that often frame themselves as platforms for free speech, how that there is ways in which there's limits on that. Maybe you can be deleted, maybe your content can be censored for community standards. And so this is further evidence of how the military-industrial communication complex structures the internet and social media. So this is the timeline we're going to work with today. So when we talk about media imperialism, we can think about the origins in the 19th century, when imperialism was spreading, as we had mentioned, conquering territory through political and economic domination. And one of the things that helped do that was technology. You can see the list of technology here. Does anybody remember what the telegraph was? Yeah? Okay. Morse code, dots and dashes. Before microphones, we used to tap things out, tap messages out. This is one of the ways the British were able to maintain their influence worldwide in their empire, was through the telegraph, getting messages. We need reinforcements, we need shipments, we need this, we need that. And in this region, the Ottomans saw the telegraph as a useful tool. And you can see this image from 1870 depicting the telegraph line between Baghdad and Istanbul. And so we know that in this region, the telegraph was also part of empire. Other forms of 19th century imperialism expanded with the printing press, and we know that in this region, the printing press rapidly became popular as a way to formulate national identities, to be part of liberation movements. The politicized press in Palestine is an example of that, and there's a lot of research on that. And what's interesting is that because the press was so politicized and newspapers were being used to organize the Palestinian people to resist the Zionist incursions, but also the British occupation of Palestine, for a time, the printing press and newspapers were not allowed to be used by Palestinians. So there was actually a ban on newspapers during the First World War. And then this also resulted in the fact that when Sykes-Picot was signed, many Palestinians didn't know it was signed. It was a secret agreement, not just Palestinians throughout this region. And so we can see the front page of the New York Herald here, where obviously the West was able to tell the story of the occupation of Palestine on December 11, 1917 from this imperialist, civilized hypocrisy perspective. Similarly, radio was also used by empire. So again, not just conquering territory through economics and politics, but also conquering the imagination. And so here we see a list of countries who were part of signing the first radio telegraph agreements. This is where they basically had discovered spectrum exists and is a way to communicate. Spectrum being the electromagnetic waves that are making it possible for you to receive translation on these devices. You're getting a signal to this. And this is going from the electromagnetic spectrum to your device here. It's the way in which we transmit radio, over-the-air broadcast, television as well. And so this spectrum, similarly like territory, like land, like water, like other resources, was carved up by imperialists. We're going to take this part of the spectrum, you take that part of the spectrum. And so critical scholars look at this as one of the best examples of politics and technology, because you can see how politicized the access, use, carving up, and taking of these resources are, but also the content. In Palestine, the British established the first radio stations to broadcast to all of Palestine, and then they aired their empire service on it. So we think of BBC as one of the bastions of free speech today, or free media, but critical scholars, critical journalists would look at the BBC and say it's just a continuation of the empire service. So these towers are on the hills of Ramallah, by the way. And then, of course, some of us know the story of what happened in Algeria. After 100 years, there was a liberation movement that rose up, and they also took to the airwaves, because when the French occupied Algeria, like the British, they also set up broadcasting. And for many years, Algerians did not own radios, did not listen to radio, because it was considered a space occupied by the French. And so in resistance to this and trying to liberate the land and the people, the FLN set up their own Voice of Algeria radio station, which Frantz Fanon wrote a chapter about in 1959, to talk about the ways in which at first Algerians refused to listen to the radio, but then when they heard their own languages on the radio, they ran out to buy radios and started listening. And then the French occupation actually banned Algerians from owning radios, from even buying batteries for a time. And so they would have secret listening parties and then spread the message for what they heard. But we can see the FLN studios here, and we know from Frantz Fanon's work that the Voice of Algeria radio was definitely part of the liberation struggle. So my point is, media aren't tools of imperialism only, they're also tools to resist imperialism. And as I mentioned at the top, we'll talk about that. So before I was in the 19th century, starting in the 20th century, and now I'm coming to the sort of still early period of the 20th century, but notably the rise of the military-industrial communications complex. And scholars point to what was happening in Woodrow Wilson's White House with the establishment of the propaganda machine and this office that developed this poster. Are you familiar with this poster? You recognize this face? Okay, that's because this face has lasted 100 years. In our minds, it's been imprinted that this is a symbol of the US, correct? That is effective propaganda. This was developed by Woodrow Wilson's White House. This is maybe less effective propaganda, but it is still propaganda. This is George W. Bush, after he conducted a second invasion and occupation of Iraq, he celebrated, if you remember, the victory, mission accomplished, by flying in on a boat as if he was Tom Cruise from Top Gun, and giving this salute, which then became his slogan for his re-election campaign. So critical scholars note that media they're not just tools of imperialism, going to Palestine, setting up a radio, and then broadcasting the Empire Service. They're also tools to support imperialist agendas on the home front as well. And so for the American population, increasingly, you can see how war is mediated, that there's a culture of militarism. Otherwise, how will American families send their loved ones off to fight battles so far away if it's not constantly legitimized to them, not just through news, but through militainment, which is the second word there at the bottom. Militainment is a combination of the words military and entertainment. And that is because there is so much information, so many movies, so many Netflix shows, as we'll learn about in the next presentation. Israel does this as well, but in the US, there's so much information that manufactures support for the military, for invasions. And there's even a wing of the Pentagon that develops Hollywood productions. The US Army hosts a festival in Los Angeles every year to give out awards for the best films taking up issues of the military. So as I mentioned, in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, we see the rise of the non-aligned movement. And out of that, we also see discussions happening at UNESCO. And because of the McBride Commission, there was actually a push to try to deal with the kind of domination that was happening at the time. And so this comes from one of the reports that UNESCO released in the 1970s, looking at the patterns of broadcast media. And so you can see how many hours of content the West is producing for the rest of the world, and what they notice is that the rest of the world is not producing a similar amount of content that is reaching those regions. Again, this is before the rise of satellite and the internet, but even in the realm of satellites and internet, we can still see ways in which those spaces are similarly Western dominated. There's been reports that only 5% of the content on social media, for example, is in Arabic. 5%. So again, Waiko at this time was trying to resist this deluge of cultural imperialism. And the right to communicate rises out of this, not just as Article 19 in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but the right to communicate is not just a right to receive information, but a right to provide information, to participate in society through information, particularly for marginalized communities as well. So that's the right to communicate, and NWICO, which also goes by the New World Information and Communication Order. Now, this started in the 1970s, continued throughout the 1980s, and then we see with the first war in Iraq, media really becoming a tool of war and occupation. And we see that because not only at this time, if you recall, if you were around in the 1980s, this is when we started to see the rise of cable network news, 24-hour network news. And this war in Iraq in 1991 was actually the first time that we had 24-hour coverage in the West of war. And what also was evident afterwards, now this piece you'll see in just a second, is on the one-year anniversary of the invasion and occupation of the First Gulf War. And so whenever this war took place, the American people hadn't heard of Kuwait, didn't know why it was occupied, and there was lack of consensus among the American people to actually support the invasion. And then this happened.
It's been 1 year since the war against Iraq began, and all last week there have been re-examinations. Among the names that have reappeared is Naira. It's been said many times, in war, the first casualty is truth. Does it apply to the Gulf War? The fact of Saddam Hussein's aggression is beyond dispute. But what about the campaign to commit American troops to liberate Kuwait? To get Americans, perhaps any people, to support a war in a place millions barely heard of, certain buttons must be pressed. In the run-up to the Gulf War, one image, one presence touched American hearts and minds like no other. It was this 15-year-old Kuwaiti girl identified only as Naira.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, my name is Naira, and I just came out of Kuwait. While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators, and left the children to die on the cold floor. It was horrifying.
Naira was testifying before the Congressional Human Rights Caucus, but in fact, she was testifying before the American people, and her story mesmerized the nation and the world. Dead babies, brutal, pillaging Iraqi monsters. It was powerful stuff, according to Congressman John Porter of Illinois, co-chairman of the caucus.
I got feedback from the president. I happened to be over at the White House the afternoon, later in the evening after the afternoon of the hearings, and the president said that he had seen it on CNN and that he was shocked at some of the things that he had heard.
And they were thrown out of the incubators.
President Bush repeated the incubator story at least 10 times in the following weeks.
Babies pulled from incubators and scattered like firewood across the floor.
There was plenty of evidence of Iraqi brutality, but the incubator story became almost a rallying cry. It had presidential confirmation and the confirmation of Amnesty International, which published a report after Naira testified, quoting her and claiming 312 babies were killed when Iraqi troops pulled them from their incubators. Then, a rather embarrassed Amnesty retracted its report. In London, spokesman Sean Stiles said, as hard as they tried, they could not confirm it.
We spoke to well over a dozen doctors of different nationalities who had been in Kuwait at the time, and they couldn't stand the story up, and it became quite clear to us that credible medical opinion was that this didn't happen.
And it wasn't just Amnesty International. The story did not hold up under repeated scrutiny by reporters and human rights investigators, including Andrew Whitley, executive director of the human rights group Middle East Watch. You went to investigate.
Yes, we did.
You went to Saudi, and then after liberation of Kuwait, you went to Kuwait.
Correct.
What did you find?
We went straight to the hospitals. We were particularly concerned with going to the maternity hospital at the Al Sabah complex. This is the largest hospital in the country, and it's a hospital that has perhaps a half to two-thirds of all the incubators in the country.
Did Iraqi soldiers remove babies from incubators in order to steal the incubators?
No, they did not. Not at all.
And what about the El Adan hospital that Naira talked about, where she said she saw babies removed from incubators?
The Adan hospital, my colleague who is a native Arabic speaker went along there and interviewed the doctors, and he was able to speak to people who said that they had been on duty at that time and that this incident didn't happen.
But you're not trying to paint the Iraqis as being saintly soldiers. There were atrocities.
There were very many atrocities, and the atrocities were largely committed by the secret police units.
That happened?
Yes, for sure.
The babies in incubators?
Did not.
If it didn't happen, where did the story come from? We can't answer that. We can't tell you about Naira. She was no ordinary witness. She's a member of the Kuwaiti royal family, related to the Emir of Kuwait. And when she testified, her father was sitting close by. He's Sheikh Saud Nasir Al Sabah, Kuwait's ambassador to the United States. Naira lives with her family in Washington, D.C.
So we know from critical scholars that news manufactures consent. Well, the military-industrial communications complex doesn't just manufacture that consent abroad, where imperialists conquer territory, as in the examples of the French, the British, the Telegraph, and so on that we saw in the 19th century and the early 20th century, but ongoing modern warfare requires media, not only for this kind of justification, but for manufacturing and engineering this kind of public consent, whether it's abroad or at home. And we can see that has serious repercussions. The occupation in Palestine is now going on 74 years. This report was done by 416 Labs, looking at US newspapers over 50 years. And the kind of data that they generate show us how the public consent is being engineered in the US against the struggle in Palestine. So for example, in that 50-year period, you know, aside from the obvious headlines that favor Israel over Palestine in US newspapers, but over that 50-year period, we can see the use of the word occupation has dropped. And we also see that similarly, the use of the word Palestinian refugees has seriously declined by 93%. And so when the average university student in the US gets asked who's occupying who, as Sujali says in his film on peace propaganda in the Promised Land, the average university student believes that Israel is occupied by Palestine. And it is because of this coverage in the US news. That also obviously supports the military interests of the United States, which supports Israel. And so we can see that on our current media, what we saw around the last May 2021 battle in Jerusalem, for Jerusalem, we saw the public, private, and social media censoring Palestinian voices. And so here I have examples of media from Germany and Canada, both of them public broadcasters. Now, we tend not to think of public broadcasters in the West as state-owned media, but they are state-owned, they're state-funded. We tend to only think of state-owned media, unfortunately, today, and we'll get to this in a bit, in terms of Russian media or Iranian media. But really, these platforms, yes, they're public broadcasters, but they're state-owned and state-funded. And we can see state policies, military agendas, imperialist ideals reflected in the strategies, the journalism, news policies of these broadcasters. And we can also see it in the actions that they take to censor Palestinian voices. So for example, in September 2020, so this is like well before the conflict that took place last May 2021, the interviewer of the main broadcast, most popular news program in Canada on the public broadcaster. And remember, there's only about 3 million people tuning into this station every day in Canada, which is the vast majority of the population. 3 million, only 3 million. That's a lot of people. But they all hear this content, and what they hear is that the Canadian public broadcaster is not even allowed to say the word Palestine. It came up, Palestine, as a term, as a reference to the land, to the people, came up in an interview with Joe Sacco about his new work on Indigenous resistance in Canada. So he's writing about Indigenous struggles. If you know his work, he's a comic journalist. So he did a new book about Indigenous resistance in Canada to colonialism in Canada. That was allowed on CBC. But resistance to colonialism in Palestine was censored, and the host the very next day had to issue an apology because on CBC they're not allowed to say Palestine, they have to say the occupied Palestinian territories. So that required an apology, and the archive of the show was actually edited so that the word Palestine was removed. And so here we have two examples from the German public broadcaster against state-owned media whose policies match the political objectives of the state. In one incident, we have a Palestinian-American journalist, founder of Electronic Intifada, who was similarly censored, had his show removed from the Deutsche Welle archive. And then in the second example, this happened just more recently, a number of reporters from the German public broadcaster were fired for old tweets that they had sent in years before, including Lebanese-based broadcasters. So we can see the censorship across public media in the West. There's also, of course, censorship on social media. And again, during the battle in Al-Quds, we saw from May 6th to May 19th, over 500 reports, and these again are just those accounts that reported takedowns or having content censored just in this short amount of time of 11 days. Again, these are just the ones that are reported. How many people in the room know someone from Palestine or in the diaspora who's had their account deleted? From Lebanon, yeah, on Palestine. Anybody accounts deleted? Okay, so this happens all the time, and you lose everything. Often they take your data. So in terms of manufacturing public consent, we see it going on. It's not just what happened during the Gulf Wars, it's also continuing today with the war in Ukraine. We can see that the White House is taking initiatives to influence social media by targeting influencers with talking points that support their stance on the war. And of course, we've seen US-owned social media monopolies taking all sorts of decisions that go against their community values and acting in ways that they previously censored Palestinians or Palestinian solidarity activists for online. And so this is similarly a problem. It's not just the public broadcasters who are state-funded, it's the social media companies that are predominantly owned by US monopolies who take advantage of that monopoly to further US imperialist interests. You can't separate the policies of a private media company from the bigger society that it's in when that society is structured by the military communications complex. Because war requires media and because the US puts a lot of investment in war, one of the biggest spenders on war budgets in the world, one of the biggest funders of Israel in the world, of course they're going to put that investment in media to justify the other. These two things are related. The military is related to the communication, and that's why we use the term military communications complex to talk about media imperialism. I want to talk a little bit about the scale of the problem, because I feel like this stuff is obvious, but we need to think a little bit broader. What's the impact? What's the threat? What's the scale of this problem? So of course we know from our experiences online that some media is labeled as state-sponsored. I don't know if you can see this behind this flag. Is it okay? Can you see? Okay, so we have here that this is indicated to be Iranian state-affiliated media. We have here Russian state-affiliated media. Voice of America. This is America's radio around the world, funded directly by the State Department since its existence, since its inception. Where is the label that this is state-funded media? It is state-funded. So if this is a policy of these social media companies, why does it apply to some but not others? Even Soapbox is affiliated. Soapbox, which is no more, was labeled as this. We have Quds News Network. Like many Palestinians, like many people from this region who are trying to put news out, unless you're logged in and you've already got your account linked as a follower there, if you go to check out Quds News Network, then you get a content warning. And so again, this filters who actually has access to your platforms. And again, we see social media companies like YouTube overturning its policies and kicking RT off, again, extending these censorship practices onto their own platforms as well. But in terms of thinking about the scale of the problem, we have to remember the investments. There are billion-dollar deals between the major communication monopolies that are coming from the US and the Zionist entity. Billion-dollar deals. So there's a lot at stake. I also want to share this with you. This is a resource, but also this is evidence of the scale of the problem. So this website, Internet Live Stats, purports to tell us how many people are online right now. I took this screenshot yesterday, 12:45 p.m., and we had over 5 billion people online. How many people in the world right now? 7 billion, yeah. So we can see that that's a majority. That's a lot of people actively online. Now, when it comes to these social media companies, we have YouTube, owned by Google. We have Facebook and Instagram, owned by Zuckerberg, Meta. And we have Twitter, now owned by Elon Musk. When we see how many people are on these platforms right now, well, at 12:45 yesterday, we can see what's at stake. We can see how many of these people are here, and here, and here, and here. And so if these platforms only have 5% Arabic content, if these platforms have no content about Palestine because of the content moderation that Anna talked about yesterday, because of the algorithms, but on top of that, because of the censorship, then we have a serious problem, and there are evident limits on free speech, which these platforms purport to represent. But as I mentioned, I want to talk about resistance too. So I want to point to a few examples of how to resist media imperialism, and then we can open it up for discussion. So in terms of resisting media imperialism, I think it's important to look to Palestine, where there has been active resistance to media imperialism since the printing press came to Palestine. And so we know that Palestinians have been printing newspapers since that time. We also know that those newspapers have been censored. We know that journalists like Shireen have been targeted. We know that media infrastructure in and of itself in Palestine was occupied. So in 1948, the Zionists actually went into radio studios and busted them up, went into newspapers and busted them up. We talk about, from a political economy perspective, the de-development of the Palestinian economy. There was a land, there was a people, there was a vibrant economy. It was the end of the Silk Road, come on, it's a huge economy. And it was de-developed because of the occupation. We can think of the media system similarly in Palestine. It had been developed. Yes, the British had set up the Empire Service and the first broadcasting to the entire region, but on the airwaves, Palestinians also set up their own radio stations to resist the British on the airwaves, to resist Zionists on the airwaves, like the FLN in Algeria. So we see that Palestinians have used radio and newspapers as tools of resistance. We also know that the Zionists have fought back, including the radio stations that were set up in the diaspora by refugees and liberation organizations, and so there were radio stations set up by Palestinians in Lebanon that were bombed by Israel. And of course, we know with the ongoing war that this kind of attack against media, workers, and infrastructure is still happening in Palestine. And of course, we have Palestinians fighting back about social media censorship, for example. So I don't know if this image is familiar to you, but there was a call by Palestinians to give Facebook, because of its censorship practices, 1-star ratings on the App Store. And it actually sunk the ratings of Facebook down to 1 or 2. Did you want to make a comment? No? Okay, we'll come to comments in a second. So these are effective tactics in terms of resisting media imperialism. We can also look at the rise of tools and ongoing discussions. This image tells us about more and more conversations about misinformation that are happening online, skyrocketing 221% on Twitter. We also have resources coming out to support thinking critically about media coverage on Palestine, and so there's the conceptualization of anti-Palestinian racism in the media, and this is really important to understand what's not just the representation, but why this misrepresentation or the censorship of Palestine is happening in the media. And so this resource is useful in terms of thinking about anti-Palestinian racism, and also more and more tools coming up to think about how to report on Palestine and the imperialist traps to resist. So I had mentioned the first net war in 1994. So if you think back in 1994, what was the internet? Before the late 90s, the internet was mostly a place for listservs or discussion boards, and then there was the early rise of weblogs. Do you remember weblogs? Weblogs. This is where the word blogs comes from. And so at that point, we didn't have user-generated content. We didn't have social media sites, but what we did have is slowly activists starting to network. And so what happened in 1994 is that the North American powers, so the United States, US, and Mexico, signed an agreement to globalize their economies under the North American Free Trade Area. And so this agreement did not seek consultation with the indigenous people. And because of this continuous sidelining, because of the impoverished nature, because of the exploitation that was happening in Chiapas, the Zapatistas organized and they took the capital of Chiapas through armed resistance on January 1st, 1994, the day that NAFTA was supposed to commence. And of course, the military government in Mexico reacted in a way that really devalued the life of the indigenous people there. They went in for a massacre. And because the Zapatistas had sent communiques through activists on the ground, and it made its way eventually onto listservs, onto the internet, all of a sudden there was all this international discussion about what's happening in Chiapas. And because of this pressure and getting the message out, and it went online, and it, for the 1994 it was viral, the Mexican government was actually forced into peace negotiations with the Zapatistas. Now, of course, those negotiations were signed in front of a lot of television cameras, a lot of news media reported on this, and then once the world felt the Zapatistas were safe, Mexico signed a peace treaty with them, massacres continued. And so for the Zapatistas, it became very important to set up media, and they did. And there's been a lot of work and a lot of thought about that, about the kind of media that they set up. So of course there was radio, of course there was television, of course their online content still continued, but the fact is they created media centers in their communities so they could tell their stories themselves, because they know without the world knowing, without being able to circulate their own content, they might be forgotten again. And therefore, if they're forgotten, if they're silenced, they can be massacred. And so a lot of media activists have looked to this as a source of strategy. And so what I'm suggesting to you is we need to look at the ways that indigenous people from Chiapas to Palestine have strategized to resist media imperialism. What are the tactics that they use, and what can we learn from that? We also have to remember how much of a threat media is. Media, as someone said yesterday in our discussion about media literacy and your definitions, is a weapon. And we can see from Shireen's quote that she knew the importance of this work. And we can see that in the way the Palestinian people and the diaspora and people around the world who watched Shireen report for 20 years have reacted on her execution. And so, of course, we know that Israel is not going to charge anybody. There will be no criminal investigation because there is no value of Palestinian life by the Zionists. And so, of course, we have to continue to resist this. And of course, we need to think about strategies. So I hope that you can bring some of this content into your classrooms and work with your students through the roots of the kind of content that they see. What is the cause of this civilized hypocrisy? In my view, it is media imperialism, and I hope you find this presentation useful. We'll open it to questions. Questions or comments? And if you want to talk more about anything that was on the slides, I'm happy to go back. Can we put the lights on in the audience? Thank you. Questions or comments? Too early? You need coffee? Did they kahwe? Say it again? Shoi. Yeah, in the back was who's got a mic? Nobody? Yeah, it's coming to you. Just a second, okay? It's coming down the line. Oh, here we go. Yep. Press and hold the button that's round. Hello?
شكرا على
Yeah, it's working.
شكرا على المحاضرة اللي يعني تعمل أساس تاريخي لما يجري حاليا تجاه القضية الفلسطينية من تضييق على الإعلام تحديدا عن الإعلام الجديد على السوشيال ميديا بالإضافة للمقدمة التاريخية حتى الدكتورة جريتشن إنه حاليا في سياسات إسرائيلية تتعامل مع الفيسبوك فيسبوك وانستغرام وتويتر لوضع حدود على المضمون الفلسطيني. هي فرصة في هاي الأكاديمية إنه تنفتح كل عقول الطلاب المشاركين من الجامعات العربية ومن الجامعات الدولية على هاي الفكرة إنه في إمبريالية حديثة كما قالت الدكتورة غريتشن اسمها وضع حدود على المضمون الفلسطيني. هذا يظهر من خلال إنه في تقييد لطباعة الكلمات على مواقع التواصل الاجتماعي. عندما تكتبون كلمة مقاومة أو شهيد تضطرون أو يعني تحدث مضايقات من محركات أو من شبكات التواصل الاجتماعي. في أبحاث كثيرة في هذا الاتجاه، وأنا أريد أن ألفت يعني انتباه كل المشاركين في هذه الأكاديمية إلى موقع اسمه موقع حملة، المركز العربي لتطوير الإعلام الاجتماعي. عندهم أبحاث عن الإمبريالية اللي بيكون فيها جوجل اتجاه الخرائط الفلسطينية، وعندهم أبحاث حول حرية الوصول إلى الإنترنت في الأراضي الفلسطينية كيف تحكمها الشركات الإسرائيلية. مادة علمية بعيدا عن الشعارات وبعيدا عن التضامن مع الفلسطينيين، بالإمكان الحصول على مضمون علمي كبير حول التدخلات الاستعمارية اللي بتقوم فيها الشركات واللي بتقوم فيها الجهات الإسرائيلية. وكمان بالإمكان يعني أو يعني توجيه عناية الباحثين إلى فكرة كيف إنه الإسرائيليين بيقوموا بحاجة اسمها الدبلوماسية الرقمية حاليا من خلال متحدثين باللغة العربية. عندهم تلفزيون اسمه I24، هو يفسد كل المعلومات في الشرق الأوسط، وهو أداة استعمارية كما قالت الدكتورة جريتشن، ذكية وتصل إلى الجمهور العربي. وبالإمكان الباحثين العرب أن يتوقفوا على هذه النقطة وأن يبحثوا فيها. وشكرا.
Thank you. Other points or questions? And yeah, go ahead.
Thank you.
In the back, we're going.
I also was wondering how we could fight online imperialism in light of technological determinism, especially when we even want to reject or protest on the Facebook standards, community standards and censorship. We also have to use the platform to launch a hashtag on Facebook rejecting Facebook measures against the content. So how we could challenge these boundaries that we feel like we have to commit to.
Thank you. There was one more question. Let's get them all together in the front here. And we'll keep doing questions until we have to break. I'm just going to check.
Hello, it's not a question, it's a comment, because thank you for the lecture, it was very important. Nowadays, the censorship is more brilliant and more smart than us. They do not say that they will stop your account because you are politically not with them. They will say that they will stop your account because you have a hate speech. Because you used a photo where you wear a kufiye and this is culturally not respectful. They will shut your account if you use the right hashtag to show the truth, and they will say why they shut down your account, because you used pictures for people without their consent. They are being very smart in the way they are shutting down the account, and you can say nothing about it because you actually really did use a picture where you didn't have a consent. You actually did wear something cultural for someone that it might be offensive. This is why we need to be really smart in how we're gonna use this against them so we stay online. Thank you.
So we're going to come to the other comments, but just to say a few points. There are ways in which censorship, yes, is pervasive on these accounts, and then we're drawn to resist that, but then we're limited in being sucked in, as you had mentioned, to these accounts and trying to do activism on these accounts. But because these platforms maintain these community standards that are not transparent to users, and in fact, the censors who sit on Israeli censorship boards, because all media is censored in Israel, it's occupied, it all runs through the military, these Israeli censorship board actors end up on the boards appointed to Facebook. And so the same people who are taking decisions in occupied Palestine are also taking decisions on platforms outside of occupied Palestine, like Facebook. We also know that these platforms are also tools used to oppress the Palestinian people. We know that Doreen Toutour, for example, who had posted a poem on Facebook, not media, a poem, and we know that Israel has a long history of censoring and killing cultural production from Palestine, those producers of cultural production, including poets. She was initially put under house arrest and then served time amounting to about 3 years because of this poem that was posted on Facebook. So my point is that we know why this is happening, because there is a common agenda between these social media companies and the occupation of Palestine. We know that these sites are being used by the Zionists to further their occupation and to justify their war. And we also know that we have been put in a corner to use these sites as sites of resistance, but it's nearly impossible. So I want to go back to something that Anna said yesterday. Think about smaller platforms, think about alternative platforms, because there will be a future very soon because of what I showed you today. The policies that are revealing themselves to be so politicized, so much aligned with the imperial interests of governments, these platforms are losing legitimacy. And so yes, they might be the place today, but I guarantee you in 10 years, social media will not be relevant, at least in the form that we see it here, where it's lacking transparency on its community ethics boards, where the policies are clearly aligned and pushing back against global social justice movements, like the movement we see rising from Palestine. And we know that social media has been useful in terms of telling the story from Palestine, but we also know that Palestinians use a diversity of media. They're not just on social media. They're still using newspapers, they're still producing films, they're still making radio, and they can't be censored on every platform all the time. And so those battles will continue, and we need to continue as activists to be thinking about all those alternative spaces. I'll say one more quick point of history that's really important to consider before we move to further questions. Before the rise of social media, there was the creation of the first website that allowed anyone to click a button and upload content. This was the first website for user-generated content, which has become the definer of social media. This website was created by, not a corporation, not a US-owned media institution, not a state, but by media activists who used open source software to create the website that became the backbone of the Independent Media Center. Open source software means that it wasn't locked down, it wasn't private code, it wasn't put there for money. So this code became used on websites, hundreds of websites around the world where independent media centers were created. Anybody could open a media center and use this website to put content out there. Of course, that also came here. We had an independent media center in Lebanon. There was one in Palestine as well. But at the same time, so this happened in 1999. This is when the Independent Media Center was launched and this website was generated. Again, at the time where it was just web blogs, where it was just listservs, this website came. And soon after is when we saw the rise of Facebook in the early 2000s. And Twitter came soon after. And these private social media companies actually took the open source software of indie media, took that technology to be able to create their own spaces for users to generate content on their own platforms, but then that software they locked down. That software became private. That software then became a money-making entity to the extreme, right? And the kinds of tactics that we see on social media companies for making money off of audience labor, off of user data, right? Because they take that labor, they commodify it, they take that data and they sell it, right? To analytics companies, people who can mine data for information for further political and economic gain. Indie media, by contrast, didn't collect any data and went to court twice because users were using the websites to share activist content, and the FBI said, you gotta give us those activist numbers, we need to find their IP addresses, and indie media said, oops, oh sorry, we don't actually collect that data. They didn't keep records of which IP addresses came to their servers and clicked those buttons. So you can see how social media is the antithesis to the kind of social movement media that was the backbone of the first user-generated content website that launched the Independent Media Center. We didn't collect data, we didn't surveil our users, we didn't monetize their online labor. Unlike social media companies who see it, not only the data and the online labor, see it as a source of high profits, but obviously a source of political influence as well. There's a couple more questions in the room. I think I saw here in the back. So we'll take a few more questions and then come around.
Thank you for the presentation, first of all. And it's more of a comment than a question. But for me, this is a really interesting experience right now because the topic of Palestine is not really discussed in Germany in this way, as in a critical way. It's almost impossible to have in an academic sphere a discussion about the occupation because you will be stamped as an anti-Semitic person immediately. So it doesn't even open up. And I had a talk with a Palestinian activist, and she was telling me, well, thank you for concerning our issues, but think about your freedom. Like, what does it tell you about your situation? How free are you in the world, in your country? How free are you when you can't even voice your opinion about Palestine and the occupation and whatever? And yeah, I think it's very interesting to have to travel 4 hours flight to another country to be able to discuss this. And I think it would be really, really great if, I don't know, whatever comes out of this experience here at MD Lab, but I think it would be really great to maybe have some kind of a network or whatever to also bring these voices to Germany, because I think we really need this. Because there's such a big backlash right now. There have been arrests for people protesting on the Nakba Day and everything, and I think it's really creepy what's going on. So yeah, thank you for this. Thank you.
Gretchen, thank you very much. My name is Ahmed. I'm from Canada. Really great presentation. I'm just wondering about what I call the other imperialisms, other media imperialisms. You know, we talk about US, I completely agree with you, probably the 2003 war on Iraq, I was there, and I witnessed everything there. But there are other players now, I think, emerging, like the Saudis. The Saudis have a whole media empire, and whose influence could also be seen in this country, and so many other countries around the Arab world, and even abroad. The other players like the Chinese, now they are trying to emerge. Maybe not as pervasive as the Americans, but they are still influential, trying to influence public opinion here in the Arab world and elsewhere. The Russians as well, RT. I think RT is becoming very popular. But I wonder about this kind of other imperialisms, the other players trying to compete with the US. And of course the British. I think in your presentation you forgot the British, but they have a very, very negative role in so many things happening today. And the outcome of what is going on today is because of what the British did and their media imperialism, starting with the BBC. I wonder what you can say about this. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I did speak a little bit to the history of British imperialism, but the examples that I gave did run across the West, and the conversation that you brought up about Germany is really important to have. And what are some of the ways forward to break through that narrative? Because it is exactly what happened to Abu Nima getting censored by Deutsche Welle. It's one of the reasons why you don't see this content or have this kind of content in Germany, is because the censorship is so heavy. Now, when it comes to the other imperialists, this is why I pointed to Samir Amin's work, is we really have to look at the gross national product and who has the wealth to be the imperialists. China is not a very rich country. Russia, as we're told by the Western media, is also not a rich country. They're losing the war because their army is underfunded. But then all of these billions of weapons are being poured into Ukraine by Western countries because they have the billions to send. Not really. It's just that the whole global economic system is sort of reliant on the dollar, and they can sink their public into more and more debt while they're building up war abroad, because that debt then doesn't matter because they're winning the war front. So I think we have to be critical about this, this notion of the other imperialists. Yes, there are ways in which state media from other countries and other regions are trying to influence here. And of course, we understand that Gulf capitalism, through the work of Golem Kobani, has structured the political economy of media in this region in that much of it is funded. And much of the satellite channels are coming from Saudi Arabia, which doesn't make sense for the KSA to dominate so much of that content in this media space. And it's also one of the reasons why Lebanon has for a long time, although it's a little bit on the rise now, but for a long time declined after being one of the centers of cultural production. And because of these different players in the region and the influence of Gulf capitalism is one of the sources of that decline. But of course, in terms of pushing back and thinking about it from the perspective of how do we create some kind of network and kind of overcome these different influences that are external, what we can learn from the Zapatistas is we have to first have our own. We have to have our own media systems that are not censored. And that's why they created these media centers throughout Chiapas, which is not a very poor place. We're talking about peasant farmers who work the land. They don't have many resources, but with the few resources that they have, they decided to support the community in media production and tell their own stories, and then send those stories out into the world so they had direct communication with the world from their perspective, not over censored social media platforms or not over censored television or other publicly owned or state-run networks. And so I think that's important to consider, and we can also see that the Palestinians have been trying to do this, and there is this growth of networks. There are more and more Palestinians and Palestinian solidarity activists who are collaborating. I specifically wrote a chapter about the history of media in Palestine, and we can see that the internet has definitely provided an opportunity for Palestinians to create websites, to create spaces for their content, but as I said, social media is really anti-Palestinian. And that content is being censored, and Palestinians can't be assured of voice on social media platforms. But they're still using other media. So for example, I'm part of a project that has created multiple marathon broadcasts, meaning broadcasting nonstop for starting with 12 hours in commemoration of the Nakba on May 15th. Our first broadcast was in 2008, and we connected with radio stations in Palestine, in North America, in Europe, and now we've grown it where it's stations participating from Asia, Africa, Europe, North America, and South America, so 5 continents coming together and producing content about Palestine, about Nakba Day. So that initiative, Radio Free Palestine, the last broadcast that we did was pre-corona, with the main broadcast in Arabic being hosted here from Lebanon. So there are ways in which media makers who are in Palestine or in support of Palestine are trying to connect and network beyond the limits of social media, beyond the limits of state-owned broadcasters. And so I think that's where we have to take inspiration from. The hope is not in other state media. I don't think so at all. Whether other state media should be censored by platforms like YouTube is extremely problematic. Who is YouTube to decide if I get access to RT or not? In fact, producers from RT who are American feel they have more freedom to critique America on RT or on Press TV than they do on state-owned networks in the US. So for sure, I want to see some Americans working on RT. I want to see the Americans who are working on Press TV. But who is YouTube to tell me that I can't access this? So this is where we have to be really critical about these other spaces that the US or Britain or the UK sees as threats, because we need to make those decisions and not let imperialists make those decisions for us. I think that's a great danger, okay? Thank you very much for your comments. Wissam has one more person. I want to check the time. Okay. We have 2 minutes. Maybe if you can put your question out there, I'll try to answer it quickly.
Yeah, Gretchen, thank you. This was an amazing presentation, and I think my presentation on Monday is going to complement well this. I just wanted to bring up something that I always tell my students when we're talking about this, and it's the issue of separability, meaning that you always have to pay attention to the fact of how much you can separate your media or your platform from the parent company. So for example, a a community in rural South America buys the equipment to set up the radio station, a community radio station. They pay the money to the company to get the antenna, the radio booth, etc. They set up the radio station, and they can totally separate from the parent company that made the technology. But in the case of social media and digital platforms, as long as you have to keep that umbilical cord with the parent company, then you're in their hands. And so this is an issue that I think we always have to pay attention to, is how much you still tie to the parent company, or which media can you separate completely from the parent company, and even though the parent company provided you with the technology, you can say goodbye and do your communication and do your media narratives without having anything to do with the corporation behind the technology.
Thank you, Clemencia. Clemencia is speaking on Monday at 10:45. You do have a break now, and I want to give you that opportunity for a break. If you do have more questions or comments, please make them. And I think that this is a really important point. It comes back to the issue of platforms. And if we want to get our voice out there, we absolutely have that kind of, need to have separability, need to have independence, and who controls these platforms is really important. But I think from Palestine to Chiapas, we can see many, many opportunities. So I'm going to pass the mic to Dr. Melky. Thank you all for your time this morning. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Gretchen. No, I was censored by the sound people. Mike.
Hello. It all went down.
What? You're censoring me. What? Imperialist.